September 6, 1966. As he waits at a bus terminal in New York City, a lone engineer idly scribbles away at a notepad, jotting down his ideas for future inventions to kill time. Occasionally looking up to take in the morning view of the city, the engineer becomes more invested in his drawings, concepts for an invention that would allow an individual to manipulate images on a television screen using a specialized control box. After the meeting, he returns to his office in New Hampshire and drafts a more in-depth blueprint of parts and circuit pathways that would allow the invention to become a reality. Calling in a fellow employee to sign off on the new schematic, Rudolf Baer, believing his invention to be the next step in military technology, has unknowingly conceived an entertainment juggernaut that today generates hundreds of billions of dollars. Rudolf Baer was born Rudolf Heinrich Baer on March 2, 1922, in Pirmasens, Germany, to parents Leo and Charlotte Baer. A family of modest means, Ralph's father Leo ran a tannery business that supplied leather to German shoemakers throughout the 1900s. This was a lucrative enterprise at first, as Pirmasens served as a major distributor of footwear around the turn of the century. However, the aftermath of World War I and the destruction of warehouses in the area severely crippled the livelihood of the town, forcing the Baers to move to Cologne in the mid-1920s as distributors looked elsewhere for suppliers. While the move to Cologne was initially uneventful, the rise of Nazism throughout Germany proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for the Baers to settle themselves in their mother country, as they were a practicing Jewish family. Over the course of Hitler's rise to power and the formation of the Third Reich, increasingly hostile and anti-Semitic policies were enacted on the Jewish public, severely limiting their ability to serve as contributing members of German society. This would result in Ralph's own expulsion from public school in 1936, as new laws would prohibit Jewish children from attending classes with their peers. Sensing impending danger, Leo and Charlotte would flee with their children to the Netherlands, just a month before Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, would see hundreds of Jewish businesses destroyed by mobs coordinated with the assistance of the Nazis and with the full support of German Chancellor Adolf Hitler. Narrowly escaping the clutches of Nazi rule, the Baers would emigrate from Rotterdam to New York in 1938, where Ralph would take up a job in his cousin's factory as a machinist, fabricating manicure kits for $12 a week. Denied a formal education in his youth, Ralph instead took technical correspondence courses using a quarter of his wages, while also crafting his first invention, a mechanical addition to factory machinery that would enable them to stitch 5 to 6 manicure cases at a time, streamlining production and generating surplus product that could be sold to other companies for additional revenue. Baer's true interests would not be in manufacturing, however. After taking his correspondence courses through the National Radio Institute of Washington, D.C., Ralph moved on to work as a radio technician in 1940, displaying stellar proficiency in the production, maintenance, and repair of commercial radios, which had become a fixture in many American households by the late 30s. The proximity of radio technology to the then burgeoning television market, which had begun commercial production in 1937 and had a similar reliance on transistors and capacitors for maintenance and repair, also enabled Baer to learn the mechanics of cathode ray tube televisions in tandem with his work as a radio technician, working on both for the next couple years until the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. In 1943, Baer would be drafted into the Army as a combat engineer, repairing radios around camp to keep his skills honed for the battlefield, while also authoring his own technical paper for the United States Department of Defense. However, upon learning Baer's status as a German Jewish immigrant, the Army would transfer Ralph from a combat outfit to an intelligence role, grouping him with other German Jewish expatriates who would be tasked with instructing American officers about German military ranks, insignias, uniforms, and small arms. Even with a diminished role on the field and a greater focus on intelligence, Baer kept at his homeland hobby of radio maintenance, on many occasions converting captured German minesweeper equipment into miniature radio systems for his unit to help pass the time. Baer would return to the United States in 1946, using his GI Bill to enroll at the Television Institute of Technology in Chicago, Illinois. Experiencing a boom of their own in the interim of the war, televisions were becoming as commonplace as radios in the average American household, with the early 50s seeing television sales jump from 3.2 million to 32 million in under 5 years. This swell in adoption would serve as fertile ground for an entirely new generation of audiovisual engineers, and Baer's tutelage under innovators such as Lee DeForest, the inventor of mechanical color television and videotape recorders, would serve as inspiration for his own industry-changing idea in the coming years. As Baer spent his young adulthood cutting his teeth in the television industry, the concept of what was to become his groundbreaking invention would occur during his time as a senior engineer at the Loral Electronics Corporation in 1950. While developing a technical schematic of a luxury large-screen television set meant for military planning, Baer suggested to associate engineer Leo Beiser, the future pioneer of laser beam information systems, that a game component should be included in the hardware, allowing owners to switch to a channel specifically to play tactical simulations and games of chance. Unfortunately, the resource requirements for such a feature, and indeed the conceptualized television, proved to be too much of a monetary investment for Loral, who scrapped the project later that year. Undeterred, Baer would jump between defense contracting companies during the peak of the Cold War, finally settling into a position as chief engineer with Sanders Associates in 1956. While Ralph's duties were primarily geared towards fabricating surveillance devices for use against the Soviet Union, his true passion still lay in inventing, with Baer producing patents for his products that ranged from read-only memory devices to parachute deployment mechanisms. His most significant invention, however, would be an idea carried over from his time at Loral Electronics. Following a routine consultation in September of 1966, Baer would create a technical document cobbled together from notes he had written at a bus stop in New York City. This document was to lay the groundwork for an external box that could be connected to a television and display interactive graphics that would mimic the experience of playing card games, board games, and even rudimentary racing and sports games. This box would be able to display these games through a series of complex circuitry and capacitors fabricated independent of the television set itself, unlike Ralph's idea at Loral to add the game component straight to the television, which would have raised the cost of commercial televisions to a prohibitive extent. To realize this concept, Baer, who worked in a managerial position, enlisted the help of fellow Sanders engineers Bill Harrison and Bill Rush to create a prototype games console to show off to higher-ups at Sanders Associates. Impressing the head of research and development with an experimental unit made with vacuum tubes instead of capacitors, the team would be given a grant of $25,000 to better flesh out the internals of the system and develop playable games. To make the project jibe with the role of Sanders as a military contractor, Baer stressed to stakeholders the gaming aspect of the console, as gaming was, at the time, military terminology for strategic simulations, and even developed a target shooting game that used the very first console light gun, a peripheral that was only available previously in specialized arcade machines. By 1967, Baer's team would present their final product to Sanders Associates in the form of the Brown Box, a wood-paneled, switch-operated system that could be programmed to display games based on the position of switches on the face of the box, the instructions of each game and its requisite switch code provided on small cards. These games would either be manipulated with a control box containing 3 knobs, with each knob having its own function depending on the game chosen, or, in the case of a unique target shooting game, with an external accessory. With a working model that included rudimentary yet intuitive games like checkers, chess, golf, and handball, Baer and his team would be given the green light to patent the methods that went into their invention in 1969. With a working prototype available for outside testing, Sanders Associates would entertain offers before finally giving television manufacturer Magnavox a license to the technology in 1972. Magnavox would refine both the function and form of Baer's creation, using their production line to develop circuit-based cartridges that would replace the switchboard on the brown box, making it easier for consumers to switch between games without needing to code the console itself. The final product, the Magnavox Odyssey, would be launched in September of 1972, 6 years after Rudolf Baer first conceived the idea of the games console. The foundational hardware for the video game industry, the Odyssey was both a technical marvel and a commercial success. Despite Magnavox only selling the console at licensed dealerships, and wrongfully implying to consumers that it would only work on their televisions, the Odyssey was still able to ship 500,000 units by the end of the following year. Players at home were presented with a console that not only had games within the system, but the accoutrements that enhanced gameplay, such as dice and poker chips to use with the casino games, and plastic overlays that would represent racetracks, ski slopes, and hockey rinks in their respective games. Even Brown Box's target shooting game would get its own iteration on the Odyssey, although the light gun required to play would be sold separately. The breakout game for the Odyssey, and the games industry in general, would not require these additions for players around the nation to enjoy. Instead, gamers only needed 2 controllers and their reflexes to play table tennis, a 2-player game that served as a simulation of the classic pastime. The simplicity of the controls belied the skill required for competitors to keep up with the ball, creating many a close game for parties entirely new to the world of video gaming. Such was the pool of virtual table tennis that other companies, including pinball manufacturer Bally, toy designer Mattel, and upstart arcade developer Atari, began fabricating their own copies of the title for home release, with Atari's Pong becoming an even bigger hit in arcades across the United States, eventually getting a home release of its own through Sears Roebuck. Magnavox would respond to these imitators with a slew of lawsuits, which served to reinforce their legal claim on the patent behind the mechanics of table tennis. Although rudimentary in hindsight, the features of the game being blatantly recreated without the proper licensing did not work in the respective defendants' favors, and a legal precedent for the now burgeoning video game industry would be set that would penalize the act of poaching game mechanics from other titles without proper attribution. Atari, for its part, would file for a non-exclusive license from Magnavox to legally distribute Pong, later responding to Magnavox's monopoly of the home console market by developing the Atari 2600, which would outpace the Odyssey's popularity soon. Back at Sanders, Baer would be rewarded with a promotion to Engineering Fellow, which would grant him more time to work on other projects related to game development. These projects would range from simulation programs for military training to a collaboration with Coleco to develop the Telstar console in 1974. The following year, Baer opened his own consulting firm, R.H. Baer Consultants, and would partner with companies to develop electronic products that utilized Baer's skills as a programmer. From developing the first ever sound chip for Hallmark to producing the memory game Simon with Marvin Glass and Associates, Baer would spend the rest of the 70s and early 80s ensuring that he was always working. Baer would finally retire from Sanders in 1985, having filed over 100 patents shared between himself and the company. At the time of his retirement, the home console industry, at one time thriving with systems like the Atari 5200, Intellivision, and the ColecoVision, had experienced a significant crash in sales following the disastrous launch of a video game adaptation of the film E.T., as well as general oversaturation of poorly developed third-party titles that left consumers feeling burned by the industry for wasting their money. As a result, the home console, Baer's lifelong passion project, seemed to have met its end as a passing fad, doomed to consignment as an obsolete cultural oddity alongside Chatty Cathy, Shrinky Dinks, and the Pet Rock. While the home console market had burned out in the United States, it was only just beginning to flourish in Japan, which experienced its own technological bubble at the start of the 80s. It would be there, in the city of Kyoto, that a company named Nintendo would release the Famicom in 1983. The success of this console in its home market would grant Nintendo the capital to distribute in Western markets the following year, resulting in the United States getting a second wind with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. Inspired by Baer's work on the Magnavox Odyssey, Nintendo executives would incorporate a first-party mindset into the licensing of titles for their console, avoiding the pitfalls of imitators that came after, and enabling the industry to regrow after a catastrophic start to the decade. Meanwhile, retirement for Baer would be just as rewarding as his tenure at Sanders. Bearing witness to the revival of his invention with the Nintendo Entertainment System, Ralph would watch the industry evolve over the next few decades as manufacturers like Sega, Commodore, and Sony introduced their own consoles. The third generation would lead into the fourth. Then the fifth. Until the turn of the millennium saw the release of Sony's PlayStation 2, Nintendo's GameCube, and the Microsoft Xbox, the release of which marked the return of an American manufacturer into the console industry since the 1980s crash. It would be around this time, as game consoles went from a multi-million to a multi-billion-dollar industry at the height of the sixth generation, that Baer's contributions to the field would finally be recognized. In 2004, Baer would be awarded the National Medal of Technology by then U.S. President George W. Bush, his induction placing him among the likes of Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Ray Dolby as one of America's most important technological pioneers. His status as an immigrant engineer would also drive him to sponsor the foundation of the Computer Game Museum in Berlin, Germany, and finally revisit his birthplace of Pirmasens in 2008. Having fled the country as an outcast in the 30s, Baer's homecoming 70 years later would be as an honored guest at the Dynamicum Science Center, where he would donate a brown box prototype for permanent display. The video game industry would continue to evolve in the following years, with physical media for systems slowly being supplanted by the ubiquity of downloadable content. The seventh generation of consoles would start this trend in 2006 with the arrival of the PlayStation 3, Nintendo Wii, and the Xbox 360, introducing further innovations such as motion controls, wireless online functionality, and streaming capabilities equal to that found on personal computers. These qualities have become commonplace following the release of the 8th generation consoles, and are now industry standard features, along with ultra-high resolution graphics, cloud-based memory, and live streaming functionality with the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and Nintendo Switch, the 9th and current generation of video game systems. Such considerable innovations have outpaced even Baer's own vision of the home console, but not his contributions. While his name is not as ubiquitous as others in the industry, Ralph Baer believed himself that his legacy was secure, owing it to both the existence of his brown box prototype, now present in cultural institutions across the world, and the recognition he received from the country that took him in, fostering his passion for invention through an education he was denied as a child. Ralph Baer would continue to receive honors from the likes of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, Carnegie Mellon University, and the University of New Hampshire School of Law until his passing from natural causes on December 6, 2014, at the age of 92. As it was Ralph's home since joining Sanders in the 50s, the town of Manchester would honor him by installing the Ralph Baer Memorial in May of 2019, renaming the downtown area where it was placed Baer Square in remembrance of the inventor.